In 1957, a gaunt harmonica player leaned into a Chicago studio microphone and spent 11 minutes ruthlessly cursing out his powerful label boss. He was Sonny Boy Williamson II, the eccentric genius who transformed the raw sound of the Mississippi Delta into the electric backbone of Chicago blues. While the mid-century music industry systematically exploited and broke his peers, he fought back by turning his entire existence into an elaborate, uncontrollable con. He stole a dead man's identity to secure fame, performed live radio broadcasts while locked in heavy police shackles, and conquered Europe dressed as a bizarre British aristocrat. Rancored executives bought his contract, expecting a compliant sharecropper, but instead, they unleashed a wildly unpredictable hustler they could never tame. The origin of Sonny Boy Williamson II is a masterclass in historical erasure. He was born on a cotton plantation in either Glendora or Greenwood, Mississippi. His birth name was Alex Ford, though he would later adopt the name Alec Miller after his stepfather, Jim Miller. His mother, Millie Ford, was a sharecropper. Alec was her 21st child. The identity of his biological father is entirely unknown. A blank space in a life that would soon be defined by them. The greatest mystery surrounding his life, however, is the exact date of his birth. Throughout his career, Alec claimed to have been born anywhere between 1894 and 1912. He frequently changed the year depending on who was asking the question. To this day, historians cannot definitively prove his age. The reason for this is as simple as it is horrifying. He had no birth certificate. To the state of Mississippi at the turn of the 20th century, the arrival of another black child on a sharecropping plantation simply did not warrant official documentation. Black bodies were not viewed as citizens. They were viewed as agricultural inventory. The system of sharecropping was slavery in everything but name. It was a carefully engineered financial prison designed to replace the exact economic output of the pre-Civil War plantation system. Families worked land owned by white landlords, purchasing their seed, tools, and food on credit from the landowner's store at exorbitant, unregulated interest rates. At the end of the harvest, the mathematics were always rigged. The sharecropper would invariably be told they had not earned enough to clear their debt. This tied them to the land for another year of forced servitude. In this environment, paper was a weapon. Ledgers were used to enforce generational debt. Contracts were used to confiscate property. Police reports and vagrancy laws were used to arrest young black men and throw them into the brutal convict lease system, most notoriously the Parchman Farm Penitentiary, where prisoners were worked to death in the fields for the profit of the state. Alec realized this very early in his life. He recognized that in a society that demands papers to control you, having no papers makes you a ghost, and you cannot chain a ghost. His lack of a birth certificate was not a tragedy to him. It was a tactical advantage. He began to deliberately obscure his identity. He lied about his age to avoid the law, to confuse debt collectors, and to create a constantly shifting persona. Lying for Alec Miller was not a malicious habit or a moral failing. It was a highly evolved, vital survival mechanism against white supremacy. If the system was built on a foundation of deception designed to exploit him, he would simply become a better liar than the system itself. He began playing music around the age of 5, teaching himself the guitar and the harmonica. The harmonica was the perfect instrument for the dispossessed. A piano was an impossible luxury, and a guitar was a major investment that was difficult to carry. But a harmonica cost only a few cents. It could be slipped into a pocket. You could run with it. Most importantly, it possessed an incredibly dynamic range of expression. In the hands of a skilled player, the tin reeds could mimic the wailing, moaning, and crying of the human voice. For a child trapped in the suffocating silence of the Delta, where speaking your mind could result in a lynching, the harmonica became a safe method of screaming. In 1932, when Alec was likely in his early 20s, his stepfather, Jim Miller, passed away. Under the laws of the sharecropping system, the debts of the father were typically transferred to the sons. Alec faced a terrifying ultimatum: inherit the insurmountable debt and spend the rest of his life picking cotton, or disappear entirely. He chose to disappear. He walked away from the plantation and officially entered the life of a hobo. It is crucial to strip away the romanticized folklore surrounding the American hobo. In the 1930s, for a black man in the Deep South, being a transient wanderer was an existence of constant, mortal terror. The vagrancy laws dictated that any black man found walking the roads without a verifiable white employer was automatically treated as a criminal. Survival required hypervigilance. You had to learn how to read the eyes of a local sheriff from 100 yards away. You had to know which towns were sundown towns, places where a black person found within city limits after dark would be murdered. Alec learned to ride the blinds of freight trains, clinging to the small spaces between the cargo cars to avoid the vicious railroad detectives who would gladly beat a stowaway to death. He slept in ditches, in abandoned barns, and deep in the woods. To survive, he relied entirely on his wits and the small piece of tin in his pocket. He financed his existence by playing music wherever a crowd gathered. He played at illegal gambling dens, rural fish fries, and juke joints. These were not polite, artistic venues. Juke joints were rough, dangerous, plywood shacks hidden deep in the woods, far away from the eyes of the white authorities. They were places where sharecroppers went on Saturday nights to blow off steam, drink illicit moonshine, and briefly forget the crushing reality of their lives. Violence was a casual and expected occurrence. Fights involving straight razors, broken bottles, and cheap pistols erupted constantly. To survive in these rooms, you could not simply sit in a corner and play a quiet melody. You had to command the space. You had to be louder, more engaging, and subtly more dangerous than the men drinking the moonshine. You had to force them to put down their drinks and pay attention to you, because their loose change was the only thing standing between you and starvation. It was during this period of violent, transient survival that Alec fully embraced the power of the alias. He knew that the name Alex Ford or Alec Miller could easily be tracked, so he abandoned his names altogether. He began performing under a rotating roster of fictional identities. Sometimes he was Little Willie. Sometimes he introduced himself as Reverend Blue or Little Boy Blue. His most famous early moniker was Rice Miller. He earned this nickname simply because he loved eating bowls of rice mixed with milk, and the locals needed a way to identify the tall, strange man playing the harmonica on the corner. This was a shell game played for the highest stakes imaginable. If a local sheriff came looking for Alex Ford regarding a debt or a vagrancy charge, Rice Miller was sitting quietly on a porch, completely invisible to the law. He was compartmentalizing his identity, fragmenting himself into multiple different characters so that the true core of his being could never be captured. But hiding was only half the battle. If he was going to make a living off his music, he had to be spectacular. The Delta in the 1930s was fiercely competitive. Every town had a harmonica player or a guitarist trying to hustle a few dimes. As Rice Miller wandered the dusty roads connecting the plantations, he began to cross paths with the foundational architects of the blues. He watched men who would later become mythological figures, observing their techniques, their mistakes, and their stagecraft. He was a sponge, absorbing the dark, heavy rhythms of the Delta and preparing to twist them into something entirely his own. He had survived the plantation, and he had survived the freight trains. Now, he needed an act that no one could ignore. As Rice Miller walked the dirt roads of the Mississippi Delta in the 1930s, he was not just looking for his next meal. He was looking for an edge. The Delta was teeming with itinerant musicians. In every dusty town and on the porch of every sharecropper's shack, someone was picking a guitar or blowing a harp, trying to hustle a few pennies. To simply be a talented musician was not enough to guarantee survival. You had to be unforgettable. During his wanderings, Miller began to cross paths with the men who were actively laying the foundational bricks of the blues. He watched Elmore James, Big Joe Williams, and the haunting, brilliant Robert Johnson. But the man who left the most profound psychological and professional impact on him was Charlie Patton. Charlie Patton was the undisputed king of the Delta blues, but his supremacy was not merely based on his guitar playing. Patton was a master of spectacle. He understood that his audience, exhausted, impoverished black laborers looking for a brief release on a Saturday night, did not just want to hear music. They wanted to be entertained. They wanted a distraction from the crushing reality of their existence. Patton would throw his guitar into the air, play it behind his head, and drop to his knees in the dirt, turning his performance into a visceral, highly physical event. Miller watched Patton and absorbed a vital lesson. In the brutal economy of the juke joints, spectacle was currency. Visual eccentricities forced an audience to pay attention. If they were watching you, they were not fighting. And if they were not fighting, they were tipping. Miller began to systematically construct a stage persona that bordered on the bizarre. He realized that the harmonica, while expressive, was a small, visually unimpressive instrument. It hid the player's face. To counter this, he invented a series of grotesque, captivating tricks. He learned how to manipulate his breathing so he could play the instrument using only his nose. But his greatest, most famous trick was entirely physical. He would take the entire harmonica, place it sideways inside his mouth, close his lips completely around the sharp metal edges, and play it perfectly without using his hands. This was not just a cheap parlor trick. It was a calculated performance tactic. By playing hands-free, Miller could suddenly incorporate his entire body into the show. He could snap his fingers, dance, or perform sleight-of-hand magic tricks while the music never stopped. The crowds in the juke joints were mesmerized. They had never seen anything like it. The tall, gaunt man with the harmonica completely inside his mouth became a local legend. The eccentricity was a shield. It made him larger than life, a mythological figure who operated outside the normal rules of society. But a great frontman needs a great foundation. For all his wild theatricality, Miller's musical timing could be erratic. He played strictly by feeling, dropping beats or extending measures whenever the mood struck him. He needed an anchor. He found one in the late 1930s when he met a young, brilliant guitarist named Robert Lockwood. Junior Lockwood was the stepson of Robert Johnson, and he possessed a musical sophistication that was incredibly rare in the rural Delta. While other guitarists were playing heavy, repetitive, single-chord drones, Lockwood had been listening to jazz broadcasts on the radio. He incorporated complex, swinging jazz chords into his blues playing. When Lockwood's steady, sophisticated guitar locked in behind Miller's wild, vocal-like harmonica runs, the chemistry was terrifyingly perfect. Lockwood provided the rhythmic discipline that allowed Miller to completely unleash his eccentric genius. They became the most formidable musical partnership in the region. Yet, despite their talent, they were still trapped by the geographical and economic limitations of the Jim Crow South. They were making a living, but they were largely invisible outside of the localized network of juke joints and house parties. That invisibility ended abruptly in November 1941, not because of a sudden shift in racial equality, but because of the cold, pragmatic calculations of capitalism. In Helena, Arkansas, a local radio station named KFFA had just begun broadcasting. The station needed advertising revenue, and they approached the Interstate Grocery Company, a prominent local business. The grocery executives looked at the demographics of the Delta and realized a fundamental economic truth. The vast majority of the cornmeal and flour in the region was purchased by black sharecroppers. To sell their product, they needed to market directly to the black community. They sponsored a live, daily radio program broadcasting every day at noon, specifically scheduled for when the sharecroppers took their lunch break in the fields. They needed a band. Robert Lockwood Jr. and Rice Miller walked into the station and auditioned. They were hired on the spot. The program was named King Biscuit Time, after the sponsor's brand of flour. It is almost impossible today to overstate the cultural shockwave this broadcast sent across the South. In 1941, the radio airwaves were strictly segregated. Black voices were rarely heard, and when they were usually heavily sanitized or presented as comedic caricatures. Suddenly, at 12:15 every afternoon, the raw, heavy, unvarnished sound of the Delta blues was blasting out of the radio. Sharecroppers would literally drop their plows in the dirt. Families would gather around battery-powered radio sets on their porches. King Biscuit Time became an instant, massive phenomenon. It legitimized the music of the rural black working class, broadcasting it across state lines into Mississippi, Arkansas, and Tennessee. But the executives at Interstate Grocery Company were not satisfied with simply selling flour. They wanted to expand their product line. They decided to launch a new brand of cornmeal. They needed a name for it, and they needed a way to instantly connect it with the black consumer base. At this exact time in history, there was already a hugely famous blues harmonica player living in Chicago named John Lee Sonny Boy Williamson. He was a pioneer of the instrument, a recording star for Bluebird Records, and his name was known in black households across the country. The executives in Helena realized that the sharecroppers in the Delta listened to John Lee Williamson's records, but very few had ever seen a photograph of him. They did not know what he looked like. In an act of staggering, cynical corporate theft, the sponsor decided to simply steal the Chicago Star's name. They named their new cornmeal Sonny Boy Cornmeal. To complete the marketing synergy, the radio announcer at KFFA was instructed to stop introducing their harmonica player as Rice Miller. When the red light went on in the broadcast booth, the white announcer leaned into the microphone and introduced the man standing next to him as Sonny Boy Williamson. For a black musician in 1941, intellectual property law simply did not exist. The corporate executives hijacked a famous black man's identity to sell groceries, entirely unconcerned with the legal or moral implications. But the most fascinating aspect of this massive identity theft is how Rice Miller reacted to it. He did not object. He did not refuse. He did not express any moral outrage on behalf of the musician in Chicago. Why would he? Rice Miller had spent his entire life running from the law, dodging debt collectors, and surviving the lethal landscape of Mississippi by adopting fake names. Deception was his primary tool for survival. He had been Little Willie, Reverend Blue, and Alex Ford. If the white men writing his paychecks wanted to call him Sonny Boy Williamson, and if that name gave him access to a massive radio audience, he would take it without a second thought. He leaned into the lie with absolute terrifying conviction. He did not try to copy John Lee Williamson's style. He simply absorbed the name and overlaid it onto his own eccentric genius. He played with such immense power, authority, and swagger on the radio that the people of the Delta genuinely believed he was the real Sonny Boy. He became a regional god. When the original John Lee Williamson learned that a man in Arkansas was using his name and making a fortune on the radio, he was reportedly furious. According to blues folklore, he even traveled down to Helena in 1942 to confront the imposter. The details of the meeting are lost to history, but the result is clear. Miller did not stop. He stared down the man whose identity he had stolen and kept right on playing. The audacity of the con reached its dark, cynical peak a few years later. In 1948, the original John Lee Williamson was tragically murdered in a violent mugging on the south side of Chicago. When news of the murder reached the Delta, Rice Miller did not drop the act. He did not revert to his old name out of respect for the dead. Instead, he claimed absolute permanent ownership of the title. If anyone ever dared to bring up the deceased Chicago musician, Miller would dismissively wave his hand. He would look the person dead in the eye and refer to the murdered man as the imposter. It is one of the most ruthless psychological maneuvers in the history of American music. Miller had stolen a man's name, outlived him, and then successfully convinced the world that the original was the fake. To historians and musicologists, he is known as Sonny Boy Williamson II to maintain accuracy. But to himself and to the millions of Black Americans who listened to him daily across the South, he had completely erased his past. Alex Ford was dead. Rice Miller was dead. He was Sonny Boy Williamson, the one and only, and he was about to leverage this stolen identity to build an empire of absolute chaos. With the stolen identity of Sonny Boy Williamson firmly secured like a crown, Alec Miller did not just participate in the Southern blues scene, he monopolized it. By the late 1940s, his influence had outgrown the dusty agricultural hub of Helena, Arkansas. He needed a larger, more dangerous playground, a place where the money flowed faster and the rules were looser. He moved his base of operations across the Mississippi River to West Memphis, Arkansas, securing his own daily broadcast on radio station WM in 1948. The significance of this move is deeply rooted in the geography of vice in the mid-century South. West Memphis was not a quiet southern town. It was the Las Vegas of the Delta. It was a wide-open, mob-tolerated haven of illegal gambling, bootleg liquor, and massive, sprawling juke joints. Because the police across the river in Memphis, Tennessee, strictly enforced curfews and vice laws under the tyrannical rule of political boss E. H. Crump, the nightlife simply migrated across the bridge to Arkansas. In this neon-lit, dangerous environment, Sonny Boy became the undisputed kingmaker. He was no longer just a musician. He was a broadcaster with the power to make or break a career. His daily radio show was the ultimate promotional vehicle. If Sonny Boy allowed you to play on his microphone at noon, your club gig in West Memphis would be sold out by 8 o'clock that night. He used this power to orchestrate the rise of the next generation of blues titans. He pulled a massive, intimidating farmer named Chester Burnett out of the fields, taught him the finer points of harmonica playing, and put him on the air. Burnett would soon become known to the world as Howlin' Wolf. Sonny Boy brought in the slide guitar genius Elmore James, giving him vital airtime. He even briefly played with a young, polite tractor driver from Indianola named Riley King, long before the world knew him as B.B. King. Sonny Boy was the gatekeeper of the Delta, holding the keys to the only platform that mattered. But wielding absolute power as a black man in the Jim Crow South was a precarious, psychologically agonizing, high-wire act. Sonny Boy was earning substantial money, driving new cars, and commanding the respect of the entire black community. Yet, he still had to navigate a society entirely controlled by white men who viewed his success with deep suspicion and hostility. He had to smile for the white executives who sponsored his show. He had to defer to the white club owners who booked his gigs. He had to carefully manage his tone when speaking to the heavily armed, virulently racist local police forces. This unbearable cognitive dissonance, being a king on the radio but a second-class citizen on the sidewalk, required an anesthetic. Sonny Boy did not turn to heroin, which was largely an urban epidemic. He turned to the cheapest, most readily available chemical in the South: hard liquor. His alcoholism was not a casual, celebratory habit. It was a heavy, functional, deeply destructive dependency. Whiskey fueled his natural paranoia and stripped away the careful, diplomatic veneer required to survive the South. When he was drunk, the mask slipped. The street-smart survivor who had dodged the vagrancy laws was replaced by an arrogant, belligerent, highly volatile man who actively sought out conflict. He carried a knife at all times, trusting absolutely no one, not even the musicians he mentored. His unpredictable temper became legendary. He would fire his band members on the air, insult club promoters, and walk out of lucrative gigs if he felt slighted. This reckless behavior inevitably placed him on a collision course with the white authorities. Law enforcement in the South routinely used minor infractions like public intoxication to humiliate prominent black figures, reminding them of their inherent vulnerability. Sonny Boy, with his flashy clothes and his arrogant swagger, was a prime target. This dynamic culminated in one of the most surreal, visually arresting incidents in the history of American broadcasting. It was a perfectly ordinary weekday, and Sonny Boy was scheduled to perform his live, daily broadcast. However, he had spent the morning heavily intoxicated and had run afoul of the local police. He was arrested for public drunkenness and disorderly conduct, thrown into the back of a squad car, and locked in the local county jail. For the police, this was routine harassment. But for the radio station and the corporate sponsors, it was a financial catastrophe. The executives at the grocery company did not care about Sonny Boy's legal status. They cared that thousands of black sharecroppers were tuning in at noon, and if the harmonica player was not on the air, the cornmeal would not sell. Panic ensued. Station managers rushed to the jailhouse to negotiate with the sheriff. They pleaded with law enforcement, explaining that the broadcast was a vital commercial enterprise. The sheriff, likely amused by the desperation of the white businessmen, agreed to a deeply cynical compromise. He would release the prisoner to perform his broadcast, but he would not let him forget who was actually in charge. The police escorted a heavily intoxicated Sonny Boy Williamson out of the jail cell and drove him to the COM radio studio. They sat him down in front of the microphone, but they did not remove his restraints. When the red light flicked on, broadcasting live to hundreds of thousands of listeners across the Delta, Sonny Boy played his harmonica with absolute, flawless brilliance. He sang his blues, promoted the sponsor's flower, and entertained the masses. And he did the entire 30-minute broadcast while his ankles were securely locked in heavy iron police shackles, with armed white deputies standing guard directly behind his chair. It is a devastating, almost literary metaphor for the reality of the black entertainer in mid-century America. His voice was soaring freely across the airwaves, crossing county lines and state borders, bringing joy and artistic brilliance to a disenfranchised population. But the physical body producing that voice was literally chained to the floor by the state. The system permitted his genius to exist only because it generated revenue for white-owned businesses, and it ensured he performed his duties in chains. By the early 1950s, the limitations of Southern radio became glaringly obvious. Being a regional star provided local power, but it did not provide long-term financial security or a national legacy. The real money in the music industry lay in pressing records. In 1951, Sonny Boy finally stepped into a recording studio. He was signed to Trumpet Records, an independent label operating out of Jackson, Mississippi. What made Trumpet unique was its founder, Lillian McMurray. In an industry dominated by ruthless male hustlers, McMurray was an anomaly. She was a white woman with a genuine, deep respect for the blues and a highly unusual commitment to ethical business practices. She actually attempted to run a transparent ledger, paying her artists standard mechanical royalties and ensuring they held the copyrights to their own original compositions. Under McMurray's direction, Sonny Boy recorded the foundational masterpieces of his early career. Tracks like Eyesight to the Blind and 9 Below Zero captured the heavy, swinging, acoustic-tinged power of his radio broadcasts. The records were regional hits, proving that his sound could translate perfectly to vinyl. For a brief, shining moment, it appeared that Sonny Boy had found a safe, equitable home in the recording industry. But independence in the music business is incredibly fragile, and ethical business practices are often a severe competitive disadvantage. By 1955, Lillian McMurray's principled approach could not withstand the brutal economics of national distribution. Trumpet Records was hemorrhaging money. The major distributors in the North were refusing to pay her for the records they had already sold, effectively starving her company of operational cash. Faced with insurmountable debts, McMurray was forced to declare bankruptcy. When an independent record label collapses, its assets are liquidated to pay off creditors. The microphones, the pressing machines, and the office furniture are auctioned off. But the most valuable assets a label possesses are its exclusive recording contracts. In 1955, Sonny Boy Williamson II learned a horrific socioeconomic lesson. He had run away from the cotton plantations in the 1930s specifically to escape a system where a black man was treated as property to be traded to settle a white man's debt. He had spent 2 decades hiding his identity, riding freight trains, and building a radio empire to ensure he would never be owned by anyone. But the laws of the American recording industry were functionally identical to the laws of sharecropping. Because Trumpet Records was bankrupt, Sonny Boy's exclusive recording contract was treated as a piece of tangible property. Lillian McMurray, attempting to salvage her creditors, sold his contract to the highest bidder. Sonny Boy had absolutely no legal say in the transaction. He was not consulted. He was simply informed that he no longer worked for Trumpet Records in Mississippi. He was now the exclusive legal property of a rapidly expanding, fiercely aggressive corporate machine located hundreds of miles to the north. His contract had been purchased by Leonard and Phil Chess. The illusion of freedom that he had built on the radio airwaves evaporated overnight. He was no longer the independent kingmaker of West Memphis. He was a depreciating asset on a corporate ledger. The system had finally caught him. He packed his harmonicas, his tailored suits, and his bottles of whiskey, and boarded an Illinois Central train bound for Chicago. He was heading into the belly of the beast. Chess Records was notorious for chewing up Southern bluesmen, locking them into predatory financial structures, and discarding them when their records stopped selling. But the Chess brothers had fundamentally miscalculated the nature of the asset they had just purchased. They thought they had bought a compliant, uneducated sharecropper who would be grateful for the opportunity to record in the big city. They did not realize they had just imported the most cynical, volatile, and highly experienced con artist in the history of the blues. Sonny Boy was traveling to Chicago, but he was not going there to be a victim. He was going to war. When the Illinois Central train carrying Alec Miller hissed to a halt in Chicago in 1955, the physical and psychological atmosphere was violently different from the humid, sprawling expanses of the Mississippi Delta. Chicago was a roaring, unforgiving industrial machine of steel, meatpacking plants, and concrete. It was the promised land for millions of black Southerners fleeing the terror of Jim Crow. But it was a promised land with a brutal, heavily segregated catch. The oppression here was not enforced by lynch mobs. It was enforced by redlining, police brutality, and a deeply entrenched system of economic exploitation. For Sonny Boy Williamson II, stepping into the headquarters of Chess Records at 2120 South Michigan Avenue meant stepping directly into the jaws of a corporate predator. Leonard and Phil Chess were Jewish immigrants who had built their independent record label from the trunk of their car into a global empire. They achieved this by recording the raw, amplified sound of the Southern migration, the electric blues. But their business model was entirely reliant on a sophisticated paternalistic system of financial control. In the 1950s independent music business, transparency was considered a fatal weakness. The Chess brothers did not issue standard, itemized royalty statements. They did not sit down with their black artists to discuss mechanical publishing splits or foreign distribution percentages. Instead, they operated a cash-from-the-drawer system. They cultivated an atmosphere of an authoritarian family. If a musician needed to pay rent, buy a tailored suit, or purchase a new Cadillac, they did not go to a bank. They went to Leonard Chess. Leonard would reach into his desk and hand over a wad of cash. If an artist was arrested, Leonard paid the bail. If they fell ill, Leonard covered the hospital bills. To the outside world, this looked like the actions of a benevolent patriarch taking care of his vulnerable artists. In reality, it was a ruthless trap. Every single dollar handed across that desk was quietly recorded in a master ledger as a cash advance. The costs of studio time, session musicians, and promotional records were heavily inflated and charged directly against the artist's theoretical royalties. As a result, the musicians were locked in a permanent state of phantom debt. They were generating millions of dollars in record sales, But on paper, they were told they owed the company money. This system was devastatingly effective against the older generation of Delta bluesmen. Men like Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf had been born into the horrific poverty of the sharecropping system, where challenging a white man over a ledger could result in death. To them, Leonard Chess, who at least paid them in cash and treated them with a rough, profane affection, was a massive step up from a Mississippi plantation owner. They accepted the financial discrepancies as the inevitable tax of doing business in a white man's world. They kept their heads down, played their gigs, and remained loyal company men. Sonny Boy Williamson II was a completely different psychological animal. He was older than the rest of the roster, deeply cynical, and entirely unburdened by loyalty. He had spent the last 2 decades outsmarting sheriffs, dodging debt collectors, and running a media empire in Arkansas. He recognized the Chess brothers' financial scam the very first time he walked into their office. He understood immediately that he was no longer an independent operator. He was a piece of intellectual property purchased from a bankrupt label in Mississippi. He could not sue them. A black man in the 1950s taking a wealthy white corporation to court over copyright infringement was an exercise in futility. But Sonny Boy refused to be a passive victim. If the label was going to steal his mechanical royalties, he was going to extract his payment in blood, sweat, and sheer psychological warfare. He decided to make himself the most agonizing, expensive, and uncontrollable asset on the Chess Records roster. The warfare began immediately in the recording studio. For his debut Chess session in August 1955, Leonard Chess wanted to ensure a massive hit. He surrounded his new acquisition with an absolute dream team of Chicago heavyweights. He brought in Muddy Waters and Jimmy Rogers on guitars, the legendary Willie Dixon on upright bass, Otis Spann on piano, and Fred Below on drums. This was the house band that defined the sound of the city. Leonard's underlying strategy was clear. Surround the unpredictable, rural eccentric with disciplined company men to keep him in line. Sonny Boy walked into the room, assessed the corporate muscle, and completely dominated the session. The track they recorded was Don't Start Me Talkin'. It was a masterpiece of cynical, sharp-tongued observation. The lyrics served as a thinly veiled threat to a local gossip, warning them that if they did not stop spreading rumors, he would reveal all of their darkest secrets to the neighborhood. But subtextually, it was Sonny Boy announcing his arrival in Chicago. He was serving notice that he knew where the bodies were buried, and he was not afraid to speak. Musically, the recording was a revelation. Instead of trying to play over the heavy, amplified volume of Muddy Waters' band, Sonny Boy weaponized silence. He played with an incredible spatial awareness. He would let Fred Below's swinging backbeat establish a deep, heavy groove, and then he would cut through the air with a single, razor-sharp wail on the harmonica. His vocal delivery was equally mesmerizing. He did not shout. He sang with a heavy-lidded, slow-rolling drawl that sounded like a man sitting in the corner of a dark room, watching everyone else make mistakes. Don't Start Me Talkin' hit the streets in the fall of 1955 and skyrocketed to number 3 on the Billboard R&B charts. It was a massive commercial triumph. It proved that Sonny Boy's Delta sound, when backed by the sheer horsepower of the Chess rhythm section, was lethal. Over the next 7 years, Sonny Boy became the anchor of the Checker Records subsidiary, churning out a staggering catalog of defining blues classics. Help Me, Your Funeral and My Trial, Keep It to Yourself, Fattening Frogs for Snakes, and Checkin' Up on My Baby. These records became the foundational texts for the modern blues. But as the hits piled up, so did the aggravation. Knowing that his records were making the label rich, Sonny Boy escalated his rebellion against Leonard Chess. He refused to adhere to the paternalistic rules. He treated the Chess headquarters like his personal bank and liquor cabinet. He demanded cash daily, refusing to perform or record until thick envelopes of bills were placed directly into his hand. He would show up to critical recording sessions heavily intoxicated, deliberately wasting expensive studio time. He would intentionally provoke the session musicians, insulting their playing and dictating erratic tempo changes just to watch them scramble. He was bleeding the label financially through sheer operational inefficiency. Leonard Chess was trapped. He was a ruthless executive who routinely fired artists for insubordination, but he could not fire Sonny Boy. The music was simply too good, and the sales were too high. Sonny Boy had successfully established a dynamic of mutually assured destruction. He was daring the label to drop him, knowing they were too greedy to let go. This volatile, highly toxic power dynamic reached its ultimate, explosive climax in September 1957. Sonny Boy had been called into the studio to record a new composition titled Little Village. Leonard Chess, seeking to replicate the commercial success of his previous hits, was sitting behind the glass in the control room, operating the mixing desk and barking instructions over the studio intercom. Chess had a very specific, radio-friendly rhythm in his head. Sonny Boy, standing on the studio floor, entirely disagreed. He wanted to play the song with a looser, more eccentric phrasing. The tape machine was rolling. Leonard hit the intercom button and loudly instructed Sonny Boy to start the song with a specific vocal cue. Sonny Boy ignored the instruction and started playing his harmonica instead. Leonard stopped the tape, hit the intercom again, and issued a sharper, more aggressive reprimand. In the 1950s, a black artist openly defying a white record executive in a room full of people was an unthinkable breach of the established racial and corporate hierarchy. The expectation was absolute, immediate compliance. Sonny Boy Williamson II did not comply. He lowered his harmonica, leaned directly into the recording microphone, and snapped. What followed was 11 consecutive minutes of the most inventive, venomous, and highly explicit insubordination ever captured on magnetic tape. Sonny Boy did not just argue with Leonard Chess. He verbally dismantled him. He attacked Leonard's understanding of the music. He insulted his intelligence. He laced every single sentence with a relentless barrage of profanity, aggressively using the term motherfucker as a noun, a verb, and an adjective to punctuate his contempt. Leonard Chess, unaccustomed to being spoken to in this manner, shouted back over the intercom, trying to reassert his dominance. He threatened, he swore, and he demanded respect. But he was fighting a man who had survived the Jim Crow South by dodging lynch mobs and outsmarting sheriffs. Sonny Boy was completely unfazed by an angry executive behind a pane of glass. He stood his ground, firing back with lethal, comedic timing, mocking Leonard's frustration and flatly refusing to play the song the way he was told. The session musicians stood frozen in the room, witnessing a profound act of rebellion. Sonny Boy was stripping the executive of his power, exposing the illusion of the authoritarian patriarch. He was demonstrating that while Leonard Chess might own the building, the microphones, and the legal contracts, he did not own the genius required to make the music. Without Sonny Boy, the studio was just an empty room filled with expensive equipment. The recording session was completely ruined. But the audio of the argument was preserved in the Chess archives. 12 years later, in 1969, long after Sonny Boy had passed away, the label decided to release the unedited 11-minute cursing match on a compilation album appropriately titled Bummer Road. It stands today as a historic artifact. It was the first blues record ever released that required a strict, explicit content warning label. But beyond the shock value of the profanity, the Bummer Road tape is a vital socio-historical document. It is the raw, unfiltered audio of a black artist refusing to be treated as a sharecropper on a corporate plantation. Despite the constant warfare, Sonny Boy remained at Chess Records into the early 1960s. He had successfully forced the label to accept him on his own chaotic terms. He had won the psychological battle. However, external forces were beginning to shift the ground beneath both the artist and the label. The musical tastes of Black America were rapidly evolving. The gritty, heavy, acoustic-laced blues of the Delta migration was starting to sound old-fashioned to the younger generation. The youth in the northern cities were tuning their radios to the polished, upbeat sounds of Motown in Detroit and the sweat-drenched, rhythmic funk of James Brown. The traditional electric blues was being pushed out of the mainstream R&B charts and relegated to older, smaller clubs on the South Side. Chess Records recognized that their domestic market was shrinking. If they were going to continue monetizing their aging roster of blues legends, they needed to find an entirely new audience. They needed an audience that did not view the blues as the painful soundtrack of rural poverty, but rather as an exotic, sophisticated, and highly authentic art form. They looked across the Atlantic Ocean. In Europe, and particularly in the United Kingdom, a massive cultural phenomenon was brewing. Millions of young, white British teenagers were becoming obsessively infatuated with American blues music. To them, men like Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, and Sonny Boy Williamson were not fading regional entertainers. They were mythological gods. In 1963, a German promotion team organized the American Folk Blues Festival, a touring package designed to bring the greatest living legends of the genre to the grand concert halls of Europe. Sonny Boy Williamson II was invited to join the tour. When the man who had survived the Mississippi freight trains and the Chicago recording studios boarded an airplane bound for London, he was about to step into an alternate universe. The European tour would not just revive his career, it would allow him to execute the final, most spectacular, and visually absurd con of his entire life. The eccentric genius of the Delta was about to transform himself into a British aristocrat, and in doing so, he would come face to face with the young white musicians who were preparing to steal his sound and sell it back to the world. When the American Folk Blues Festival tour touched down in Europe in the autumn of 1963, the cultural collision was instantaneous, jarring, and historically profound. The touring package, meticulously organized by German promoters Horst Lippmann and Fritz Rau, brought a staggering lineup of blues titans, including Muddy Waters, Willie Dixon, Otis Spann, and Sonny Boy Williamson II, across the Atlantic. The psychological shock these musicians experienced is only clear when measured against the brutal environment they had just left behind. In the United States, even at the absolute height of their creative powers, these men were second-class citizens. They performed in smoky, dangerous, deeply segregated clubs on the south side of Chicago, or in the volatile, mob-run juke joints of the South. They were routinely harassed by the police, systematically robbed by their record labels, and entirely ignored by the mainstream white American media. They were playing survival music for a marginalized working class. When they stepped onto the stages of London, Paris, Frankfurt, and Copenhagen, they stepped into an alternate reality. The European audiences, largely composed of young, middle-class, university-educated white youths, did not treat the blues as background music for drinking and dancing. They treated it as high art. They treated it like a religion. The concert halls were massive, acoustic marvels. When the American musicians walked onto the stage, the European crowds did not shout or throw bottles. They sat in hushed, reverent, dead silent anticipation. They studied the fingerings on the guitar fretboards. They took furious academic notes on the microphone placements. They treated the battered, heavily scarred black men from the Delta not as regional entertainers, but as visiting deities. For many of the bluesmen, this sudden, overwhelming adulation was deeply moving. It was the first time in their lives they were being treated with absolute, unconditional human dignity. Men who had spent decades keeping their heads down and absorbing the daily humiliations of American racism were suddenly being asked for their autographs by weeping European teenagers. But Sonny Boy Williamson II did not weep. He did not feel humbled, and he certainly did not feel grateful. Sonny Boy looked out at the polite, academic European audiences, and his hyper-tuned survival instincts immediately went to work. He understood exactly what the European crowds wanted. They were infatuated with the romanticized, tragic mythology of the American Negro. They wanted to see the broken, downtrodden sharecropper. They wanted authenticity, measured by the amount of visible suffering a musician could project on stage. They expected him to walk out in denim overalls, looking like a man who had just stepped off a Mississippi cotton field, ready to bleed his pain into the microphone for their intellectual edification. Sonny Boy flatly refused to give them the satisfaction. He refused to be a museum piece of black trauma. Instead, he decided to execute the most spectacular, visually absurd, and deeply subversive con of his entire life. If the Europeans wanted a performance, he was going to give them a masterpiece of psychological theater. He took the handsome cash advances provided by the tour promoters and walked directly into the high-end tailoring districts of London. He did not buy a standard, respectable suit. He ordered a bespoke, custom-tailored, two-tone harlequin suit. One half of the suit was charcoal gray. The other half was pitch black, split directly down the center line of his body. It was a garment of pure, eccentric madness. He then purchased a stiff, formal bowler hat, the ultimate unmistakable symbol of the wealthy, white British banking class. He bought a tightly rolled gentleman's umbrella, which he carried everywhere, rain or shine. Finally, he replaced his battered gig bag with a sleek leather attaché case. He designed the inside of the briefcase with custom compartments, one side perfectly fitted to hold his collection of harmonicas, and the other side perfectly sized to hold a full bottle of Scotch whiskey. When Sonny Boy Williamson walked the foggy streets of London or stepped onto the stage at the Croydon Fairfield Halls, the visual impact was staggering. He was a gaunt, heavily scarred black man, born in the dirt of a Mississippi plantation, dressed in the exact uniform of the global financial elite, but warped through a lens of absolute eccentricity. It was a profound, silent middle finger to the expectations of everyone in the room. By adopting the exaggerated costume of a British aristocrat, he was mocking the rigid class structures of Europe while simultaneously insulating himself against their pity. He was telling the audience, "I am not your tragic, noble savage. I am not your victim. I am richer than you. I am smarter than you, and I am entirely in control of this transaction." This subversive attitude extended directly to his interactions with the young, obsessive British musicians who were currently driving the UK blues revival. In the early 1960s, a generation of British teenagers had discovered the imported vinyl records of Chess Records. Bands like the Rolling Stones, the Yardbirds, and the Animals were building their entire careers by meticulously copying the riffs, the vocal inflections, and the heavy grooves of the Chicago masters. When Sonny Boy arrived in London, these young musicians flocked to him. They followed him around the city like disciples following a prophet. The promoters, seeing a massive commercial opportunity, booked Sonny Boy to play a series of live club dates and recording sessions backed by these young white British bands. In December 1963, Sonny Boy walked into the Crawdaddy Club in Richmond to record a live album backed by the Yardbirds, a band that featured a brilliant, fiercely dedicated young guitar prodigy named Eric Clapton. The dynamic on stage and in the studio was brilliantly, painfully awkward. The Yardbirds were terrified, desperate to prove their worth to the master. They had spent thousands of hours in their bedrooms perfectly memorizing the bass lines and the guitar solos from Sonny Boy's old Checker Records singles. They knew the mechanical structure of the songs perfectly, but Sonny Boy did not play music mechanically. He played music psychologically. He viewed these young, white, middle-class British kids with a complex mixture of amusement, deep cynicism, and paternalistic condescension. He knew exactly what they were doing. They were appropriating his culture. They were taking the sound of his survival, stripping away the actual mortal danger of the Mississippi Delta, and using it to become rich and famous in Europe. He did not hate them for it. He was a hustler, and he respected the hustle, but he absolutely refused to let them think they were his equals. To prove his point, Sonny Boy actively tortured the British bands on stage. He would intentionally change the tempo of a song right in the middle of a verse, dropping beats or extending a vocal line just to watch the young musicians panic and scramble to catch up to him. He would signal for a guitar solo and then immediately step on the solo by blowing a massive, distorted note on his harmonica, asserting his absolute dominance over the sonic space. He was treating the stage like a juke joint, relying on instinct and danger, while the British kids were trying to treat it like a recital. He forced them to realize that playing the correct notes was entirely irrelevant if you did not have the weight of the life behind the notes. When the European tour concluded and Sonny Boy returned to the United States, a music journalist asked him what he thought of the young white British rock bands who were currently dominating the radio by playing his music. Sonny Boy did not offer a polite, diplomatic answer. He did not thank them for keeping the blues alive. He took a drag from his cigarette, looked at the reporter with heavy, cynical eyes, and delivered a quote that remains one of the most devastating, surgically accurate critiques in the history of rock and roll. "Those English boys," he said slowly, "they want to play the blues real bad. And they do. Real bad." The quote is frequently repeated simply as a humorous insult, a witty dismissal from a grumpy old man, but to read it merely as a joke is to miss the profound, tragic depth of his observation. When Sonny Boy said they played it real bad, he was making a definitive statement about the nature of trauma and artistic authenticity. The British kids had the amplifiers, they had the right guitars, they had the technical proficiency to bend the strings exactly the way Robert Johnson or Muddy Waters had bent them. But what Eric Clapton, Eric Burdon, and Mick Jagger did not have, and could never have, was the terror. They did not know what it felt like to hide in a ditch while a lynch mob rode past. They did not know the suffocating generational despair of the sharecropping system. They had never been arrested for vagrancy, stripped of their identity, and forced to perform a radio broadcast while locked in iron police shackles. The British bands were playing the sound of the blues, but Sonny Boy Williamson had lived the cause of the blues. He understood that you cannot successfully mimic the sound of a man screaming for his life if your life has never actually been in danger. The technical mimicry was flawless, but the spiritual core was entirely hollow. That is why they played it real bad. Yet, despite his deep cynicism regarding his British acolytes, the European tours of 1963 and 1964 represented the absolute zenith of his career. He was making more money than he ever had in his life. He was treated like royalty. He could have stayed in Europe. Many expatriate Black American jazz and blues musicians had already relocated permanently to Paris or London, trading the violent, systemic racism of America for the polite, albeit fetishized, acceptance of the European continent. But Sonny Boy Williamson II was a creature of the Delta. Europe was a lucrative theater, but it was not real. The polite applause of the concert halls felt sterile compared to the dangerous, kinetic energy of the Southside Chicago clubs or the Arkansas juke joints. The European audiences revered him as a historical artifact, but he did not want to die in a museum. He wanted to go home. By early 1965, the years of relentless, heavy drinking, combined with the extreme physical stress of a lifetime spent on the road, had finally caught up with his body. He was suffering from severe hypertension. His liver was failing. He was coughing up blood. The man who had spent his entire life outrunning his past suddenly realized that the road was coming to a definitive end. He packed up his two-tone harlequin suit, his bowler hat, his rolled umbrella, and his custom briefcase. He boarded a flight back to the United States, turned his back on the money and the global adulation, and headed straight back to the suffocating heat of the Mississippi Delta. He was returning to the exact geographical coordinates where his life of deception had begun. The ultimate con man, realizing his time was out, felt a sudden, desperate urge to finally be seen for who he truly was. But as he stepped off the train in the Deep South, carrying the physical proof of his global conquests, he was about to discover the most horrifying consequence of a life spent in the shadows. He was about to learn that when you spend 30 years convincing the world that you are a liar, the world will refuse to believe you, even when you finally decide to tell the truth. In the spring of 1965, Alec Miller stepped off a train into the humid, suffocating air of the Mississippi Delta. He was dying. Decades of raw whiskey, unfiltered cigarettes, and the physical toll of a hunted life had finally destroyed his organs. He could have stayed in Europe, living out his final days in comfort, treated like royalty by British fans. Instead, he returned to the epicenter of his trauma. He wanted the ultimate validation. He walked into the dusty, unpaved agricultural towns wearing the physical proof of his victory, his bizarre European aristocratic disguise. He sat down on the sagging porches of sharecropper shacks and told his old contemporaries the truth. He told them he had conquered the world, that white men in expensive suits had bowed to him, and that he had taken their money. The reaction was a devastating psychological blow. Nobody believed a single word. To the local farmhands, he was still just Rice Miller, the most notorious, elaborate liar in Mississippi. They laughed at his suit. They dismissed his European triumphs as just another ridiculous, drunken hustle. As one local later noted, he could have replaced Europe with Mars, and they would have reacted the exact same way. This was his tragic Shakespearean punishment. The deception he had weaponized to survive Jim Crow had calcified into an impenetrable wall. When the ultimate con man finally decided to tell the truth, his own people refused to see him. He was permanently trapped in his own mythology. Resigned to his isolation, he returned to the only reality he could control. He walked back into the KFFA radio studios in Helena and reclaimed his microphone on King Biscuit time. His breath was weaker, the acrobatic tricks were gone, but his phrasing was heavier than ever. He stripped the music down to its rawest, bleeding essence. He wasn't playing to entertain anymore. He was playing to say goodbye. In his final weeks, he wandered the dirt roads of the Delta. He silently visited the overgrown plantations where he had once picked cotton and the dilapidated juke joints where he had fought for dimes. He was closing the ledgers of his life, making peace with the blood-soaked soil he had spent 30 years outrunning. On May 25, 1965, Alec Miller went to sleep in a small rented room in Helena and never woke up. A massive heart attack claimed him before his next broadcast. The industry's final insult was grim. The man who generated millions for chess records and provided the sonic blueprint for the British invasion was dumped into the Mississippi dirt without a proper headstone. It took 15 years for a coalition of fans to finally buy him a granite marker. The mid-century American music industry was a highly efficient machine. It was mathematically designed to extract black trauma, press it onto vinyl, and discard the human being. Alec Miller was the ultimate glitch in that machine. His life is a stark, brutal reminder that when a system is explicitly engineered to destroy you, compliance is not a virtue, it is a death sentence. He survived by weaponizing chaos, deception, and uncompromising rebellion. He stole a famous man's name, hijacked the Southern radio airwaves, forced a ruthless corporate empire to bend to his will, and mocked the European audiences who tried to pity him. The industry wanted to own a subservient, grateful bluesman. Instead, they got a ghost who took their money, cursed their names, and left behind an immortal, defiant roar that the world is still trying to catch up to.